All right, guys. Welcome back to the seventh part of the reading of No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai, read by Sleepless Tales. We'll be starting Notebook 3, Part 2. We'll probably get this out in 2 parts, and we'll be finishing it on the next one. So, we're almost done, guys. Hang in there. Anyways, don't forget to like, favorite, whatever. Anyways, let's get this started. Okay. Horiki and myself. Despising each other as we did, we were constantly together, thereby degrading ourselves. If that is what the world calls friendship, the relations between Horiki and myself were undoubtedly those of friendship. I threw myself on the chivalry of a madam in the bar in Kyobashi. It is a strange use of the word to speak of a woman's chivalry, but in my experience, at least in the cities, the women possessed a greater abundance of what might be termed chivalry than the men. Most men concern themselves, all fear and trembling, only with appearances, and were stingy to boot. She enabled me to marry Yoshiko, and to rent a room on the ground floor of an apartment building near the Sumida River, which we made our home. I gave up drink and devoted my energies to drawing cartoons. After dinner, we would go out together to see a movie, and on the way back, we would stop at a milk bar or buy pots of flowers. But more than any of these things, it gave me pleasure just to listen to the words or watch the movements of my little bride, who trusted in me with all of her heart. Then, when I had begun to entertain faintly in my breast the sweet notion that perhaps there was a chance I might turn one of these days into a human being and be spared the necessity of a horrible death, Horiki showed up again. He hailed me. "How's the great lover?" What's this? Do I detect a note of caution in your face? You, of all people? I've come today as a messenger from the lady of Koenji. He lowered his voice and thrust his jaw in the direction of Yoshiko, who was preparing tea in the kitchen, as much as to ask whether it was all right to continue. I answered nonchalantly, Doesn't matter, you can say anything before her. As a matter of fact, Yoshiko was what I should like to call a genius at trusting people. She suspected nothing of my relations with the madam of the bar in Kyobashi, and even after I told her all about the incident which occurred at Kamakura, she was equally unsuspicious of my relation with Tsuneko. It was not because I was an unaccomplished liar. At times I spoke quite bluntly, but Yoshiko seemed to take everything I said as a joke. You seem to be so cocksure of yourself as ever. Anyways, it's nothing important. She asked me to tell you to visit her once in a while. Just when I was beginning to forget, that bird of ill omen came flapping my way, to rip open with its beak the wounds of memory. All at once, shame over the past and the recollection of sin unfolded themselves before my eyes, and, seized by a terror so great it made me want to shriek. I could not sit still a moment longer. How about a drink, I asked. This suits me, said Horiki. Horiki and myself, though outwardly he appeared to be a human being like the rest, I sometimes felt he was exactly like myself. Of course, that was only after we'd been making the round of the bars, drinking cheap liquor here and there. When the two of us met face to face, it was as if we immediately metamorphosed into dogs of the same shape and pelt, and we bounded out through the streets covered with fallen snow. That was how we happened to warm over, as it were, the embers of our old friendship. We went together to the bar in Kyobashi, and eventually, we too soused the dogs, visited Tsushiko's apartment in Koenji, where I sometimes spent the night. I shall never forget. It was a sticky, hot summer's night. Horiki had come to my apartment about dusk, wearing a tattered summer kimono. He told me that emergency had come up, and he had been obliged to pawn his summer suit. He asked me to lend him some money, because he was anxious to redeem the suit, before his mother found out. The matter apparently concerned him genuinely. As ill luck would have had it, I hadn't any money at my place. As usual, I sent Yoshiko out to the pawn shop with some of her clothes. I lent Horiki what he needed from the money she received, but there was still a little left over, and I asked Yoshiko to buy some gin with it. We went up on the roof of the apartment house, where we celebrated the evening cool with a dismal little party. Faint, miasmic gusts of wind blew in from the river every now and then. We began a guessing game of tragic and comic nouns. This game, which I myself had invented, was based on the proposition that just as nouns could be divided into masculine, feminine, and neuter, so there was a distinction between tragic and comic nouns. For example, this system decreed that steamship and steam engine were both tragic nouns, while streetcar and bus were comic. Persons who failed to see why this was true were obviously unqualified to discuss art, and a playwright who included even a single tragic noun in a comedy showed himself a failure, if for no other reason. The same held equally true of comic nouns in tragedies. I began the questioning. Are you ready? What is tobacco? Tragic, Horiki answered promptly. What about medicine? Powder or pills? Injection. Tragic. I wonder. Don't forget, these are hormone injections too. No, there's no question that it's tragic. First of all, there's a needle. What could be more tragic than a needle? You win. But, medicines and doctors are, surprisingly enough, comic. What about death? Comic. And that goes for the Christian ministers and Buddhist priests, too. Bravo. Then life must be tragic? Wrong. It's comic, too. In that case, everything becomes comic. Here's one more for you. What about cartoonist? You couldn't possibly call it a comic noun, could you? Tragic. An extremely tragic noun. What do you mean? Extremely tragic is a good description of you. Any game which can drop to the levels of such abysmal jokes is despicable, but we were very proud of what we considered to be an extremely witty diversion, never before known in the salons of the world. I had invented one other game of a rather similar character, a guessing game of antonyms. The antonym of black is white, but the antonym of white is red. The antonym of red is black. I asked now, what's the antonym of flower? Horiki frowned and thought. Let me see. There used to be a restaurant called the Flower Moon. It must be moon. That's not an antonym, it's more of a synonym. Aren't star and garter synonymous? It's not an antonym. I've got it. It's bee. Bee? Aren't there bees? Or is it ants and peonies? What are you trying to do? No bluffing now. I know. Clustering clouds that cover the flowers. You must be thinking of clouds that cover the moon. That's right. Wind that destroys the blossoms. It's the wind. The antonym of flower is wind. Pretty poor. Sounds like a line out of a popular song. You betray your origins. Well then, how about something more recondite? Say, a mandolin. Still no good. The antonym of flower. You're supposed to name the thing in the world which is least like a flower. That's what I'm trying to do. Wait, how about this? A woman. Then what's the synonym for woman? Entrails. You're not very poetic, are you? Well, then what's the synonym for entrails? Milk. That's pretty good. One more in that vein. Shame. What's the synonym of shame? Shameless. A popular cartoonist I could name. What about Masao Horiki? By the time we reached this point, he had gradually become incapable of laughter, and we were beginning to experience a particular oppressiveness, as if one's head were stuffed with broken glass, that comes from getting drunk on gin. Don't be cheeky now. I, for one, have never been tied up like a common criminal the way that you have. I was taken aback. Horiki at heart did not treat me like a full human being. He could only consider me as a living corpse of a would-be suicide, a person dead to shame, an idiot ghost. His friendship had no other purpose but to utilize me in whichever way would most further his own pleasures. This thought, naturally, did not make me very happy, but I realized after a moment that it was entirely to be expected that Horiki should take this view of me, that from long ago, even as a child, I seemed to lack the qualifications of a human being, and that, for all I know, contempt, even from Horiki, might be entirely merited. I said, feigning tranquility, Crime. What's the antonym of crime? This is a hard one. The law, of course, Horiki answered flatly. I looked at his face again, caught in the flashing red light of a neon sign on a nearby building. Horiki's face had the somber dignity of the relentless prosecutor. I felt shaken to the core. Crime belongs in a different category. Imagine saying that the law was the antonym of crime, but perhaps everybody in society can go on living in self-satisfaction, thanks to such simple concepts. They think that crime hatches where there are no policemen. Well, in that case, what could it be? God? That would suit you. There's something about you that smells a little of a Christian priest. I find it offensive. Let's not dispose of the problem so lightly. Let's think about it a bit more together. Isn't it an interesting theme? I feel you can tell everything about a man, just from his answer to this one question. You can't be serious. The antonym of crime is virtue, a virtuous citizen. In short, someone like myself. Let's not joke. Virtue is the synonym of vice, not crime. Are vice and crime different? They are, I think. Virtue and vice are concepts invented by human beings, words for morality, which human beings arbitrarily devised. What a nuisance. Well, I suppose it is God in that case. God. You can't go wrong if you leave everything at God. God, I'm hungry. Yoshiko is cooking some beans downstairs now. Thanks, I like beans. He lied down on the floor, his hands tucked under his head. I said, "You don't seem to be very interested in crime." That's right. I'm not a criminal like you. I may indulge myself with a little dissipation, but I don't cause women to die, and I don't lift money from them either. The voice of a resistance, weak but desperate, spoke from somewhere in my heart. It said that I had not caused anyone to die, that I had not lifted money from anyone. But once again, the ingrained habit of considering myself evil took command. It is quite impossible for me to contradict anyone to his face. I struggled with all of my might to control the feelings which mounted more dangerously in me with each instant, the result of the depressing effects of the gin. Finally, I muttered, almost to myself, actions punishable by jail sentences are not the only crimes. If we knew the antonym of crime, I think we would know its true nature: God, salvation, love, light. But for God, there is the antonym, Satan. For salvation, there is perdition. For love, there is hate. For light, there is darkness. For good, evil. Crime and prayer, crime and repentance, crime and confession, crime and... No, they're all synonymous. What is the opposite of crime? Well, if you spell crime backwards... no, that doesn't make sense. But the word does contain the letters R-I-C-E in Japanese. Rice, I'm hungry. Bring me something to eat. Why don't you go get it yourself? My voice shook with the rage I had almost never betrayed. All right, I'll go downstairs. Then Yoshiko and I will commit a crime together. Personal demonstration is better than empty debates. The antonym of crime is rice. No, it's beans. He was so drunk he could barely articulate the words. Do as you please. Only get the hell out of here. He got up, mumbling incoherently. Crime and an empty stomach. Empty stomach and beans. No, those are synonyms. Crime and punishment. Dostoevsky. These words grazed over a corner of my mind, startling me. Just supposing Dostoevsky raged crime and punishment side by side, not as synonyms, but as antonyms. Crime and punishment. Absolutely incompatible ideas. Irreconcilable as oil and water. I felt I was beginning to understand what lay at the bottom of the scum-covered, turbid pond, that chaos of Dostoevsky's mind. No, I didn't quite see. Such thoughts were flashing through my head, like a revolving lantern, when I heard a voice. Extraordinary beans you've got there. Come have a look. Horiki's voice and color had changed. Just a minute before, he had staggered off downstairs, and here he was, back again, before I knew it. What is it? A strange excitement ran through me. The two of us went down from the roof to the second floor, and were halfway down the stairs to my room on the ground floor when Horiki stopped me and whispered, "Look!" He pointed. A small window opened over my room, through which I could see the interior. The light was lit, and two animals were visible. My eyes swam, but I murmured to myself through my violent breathing. This is just another aspect of the behavior of human beings. There's nothing to be surprised at. I stood petrified on the staircase, not even thinking to help Yoshiko. Horiki noisily cleared his throat. I ran back up to the roof to escape and collapsed there. The feelings which assailed me as I looked up into the summer night, sky heavy with rain, were not of fury or hatred, nor even of sadness. They were of overpowering fear. Not the terror the sight of ghosts in a graveyard might arouse, but rather a fierce ancestral dread that could not be expressed in 4 or 5 words. Something perhaps like encountering in the sacred grove of a Shinto shrine the white clothed body of the god. My hair turned prematurely gray from that night. I had now lost all confidence in myself, doubted all men immeasurably, and abandoned all hopes for the things of this world, all joy, all sympathy, eternally. This was truly the decisive incident of my life. I had been split through the forehead, between the eyebrows, a wound that was to throb the pain whenever I came in contact with a human being. I sympathize, but I hope it's taught you a lesson. I won't be coming back. This place is a perfect hell. But you should forgive Yoshiko. After all, you're not much of a prize yourself. So long. Horiki was not stupid enough to linger in an embarrassing situation. I don't know if you caught that last part, dear reader, but young girlfriend was in fact cheating on main character fella. Yikes. I got up and poured myself a glass of gin. I wept bitterly, crying aloud. I could have wept on, interminably. Without my realizing it, Yoshiko was standing haplessly behind me, bearing a platter with a mountain of beans on it. He told me you wouldn't do anything. It's all right. Don't say anything. You didn't know enough to distrust others. Sit down, let's eat the beans. We sat down side by side and ate the beans. Is trustfulness a sin, I wonder? The man was an illiterate shopkeeper, an undersized runt of about 30, who used to ask me to draw cartoons for him, and then would make great ado over the trifling sums of money he paid for them. The shopkeeper, not surprisingly, did not come again. I felt less hatred for him than I did for Horiki. Why, when he first discovered them together, had he not cleared his throat then, instead of returning to the roof to inform me? On nights when I could not sleep, hatred and loathing for him gathered inside me until I groaned under the pressure. I neither forgave nor refused to forgive her. Yoshiko was a genius at trusting people. She didn't know how to suspect anyone. But the misery it caused? God, I ask you, is trustfulness a sin? It was less the fact of Yoshiko's defilement than the defilement of her trust in people who had become so persistent a source of grief as almost to render my life insupportable. For someone like myself, in whom the ability to trust others is so cracked and broken that I am wretchedly timid and am forever trying to read the expression on people's faces, Yoshiko's immaculate trustfulness seemed clean and pure, like waterfall among green leaves. One night sufficed to turn the waters of this pure cascade yellow, muddy. Yoshiko began from that night to fret over my every smile or frown. She would jump when I called her, and seemed at a loss which way to turn. She remained tense and afraid, no matter how much I tried to make her smile. No matter how much I played the clown. She began to address me with an excessive profusion of honorifics. Honorifics being the Japanese sanchan, so on, right? They do makes it more professional. Is immaculate trustfulness, after all, a source of sin? I looked up various novels in which married women are violated. I tried reading them, but I could not find a single instance of a woman violated in so lamentable a manner as Yoshiko. Her story, obviously, could never be made into a novel. I might actually have felt better if anything in the least resembling love existed between that runt of a shopkeeper and Yoshiko. But one summer night, Yoshiko was trusting, and that was all there was to it. And on account of that incident, I was cleft between the eyebrows. My voice became hoarse, my hair turned prematurely gray, and Yoshiko was condemned to a life of anxiety. In most of the novels I've read, emphasis was placed on whether or not the husband forgave the wife's act. It seemed to me, however, that any husband who still retains the right to forgive or not to forgive is a lucky man. If he thinks that he can't possibly forgive his wife, he ought, instead of making such a great fuss, to get divorced as quickly as possible and find a new wife. If he can't do that, he should forgive her and show forbearance. In either case, the matter can be completely settled in whichever the way the husband's feelings dictate. In other words, even though such an incident certainly comes as a great shock to the husband, it is a shock and not an endless series of waves which lash back at him over and over again. It seemed to me a problem which could be disposed of by the wrath of any husband with authority. But in our case, the husband was without authority. And when I thought things over, I came to the feeling that everything was my fault. Far from being enraged, I could not utter a single word of complaint. It was on account of that rare virtue she possessed that my wife was violated, a virtue I long had prized, the unbearably pitiful one called immaculate trustfulness. Is immaculate trustfulness a sin? Now that I harbored doubts about the one virtue I had depended on, I lost all comprehensions of everything around me. My only resort was drink. My face coarsened markedly, and my teeth fell out from the interminable drinking bouts to which I surrendered myself. The cartoons I drew now verged on the pornographic. No, I'll come out with it plainly. I began about this time to copy pornographic pictures which I secretly peddled. I wanted money to buy gin. When I looked at Yoshiko, always averting her glance and trembling, doubt gave birth to fresh doubt. It was unlikely, wasn't it, that a woman with absolutely no defenses should have yielded only that once with the shopkeeper. Had she also been with Horiki, or with somebody I didn't even know? I hadn't the courage to question her. Writhing in my usual doubts and fears, I drank gin. Sometimes when drunk, I timidly attempted a few sneaking ventures at indirect questioning. In my heart, I bounded foolishly from joy to sorrow at her responses, but on the surface, I never ceased my immoderate clowning. Afterwards, I would inflict on Yoshiko an indomitable, hellish caressing before I dropped into a dead sleep. Towards the end of that year, I came home late one night, blind drunk. I felt like having a glass of sugar water. Yoshiko seemed to be asleep, so I went myself to the kitchen to look for the sugar bowl. I took off the lid and peered inside. There was no sugar, only a thin black cardboard box. I took it absent-mindedly in my hand and read the label. I was startled. Somebody had scratched off most of the writing, but the part in Western letters remained intact. The word dial was legible. Dial. At that time, I relied entirely on gin and never took sleeping pills. Insomnia, however, was a chronic complaint with me, and I was familiar with most sleeping pills. The contents of this one box of dial was unquestionably more than sufficient to cause death. The seal of the box was unbroken. I must have hidden it here at some point or other in the past when I felt I might need it. After first scratching off the label. The poor child could not read Western letters, and I must have thought it was enough if I just scratched off with my nails the part of the labels in Japanese. You've committed no sin. I very quietly filled a glass with water, careful to make the least noise, and deliberately broke the seal of the box. I poured the whole contents into my mouth. I calmly drained the glass of water in one gulp. I switched off the light and went to bed at once. For 3 days and nights, I lay as one dead. The doctor considered it an accident and was kind enough to postpone reporting to the police. I am told that the first words I murmured as I began to recover consciousness were, "I'm going home." It's not clear even to myself what place I meant by home, but in any case, these were the words I said, accompanying, as I was told, by profuse weeping. Gradually the fog cleared, and when I regained consciousness, there was Flatfish sitting by my pillow, a most unpleasant expression on his face. The last time was also at the end of the year, wasn't it? He always chooses the end of the year, just when everybody's frantically busy. He'll prove the death of me if he keeps on doing such things. The madam of the bar in Kyobashi was the recipient of Flatfish's discourse. I called, "Madame." "What? Have you come too?" She held her smiling face directly over mine as she spoke. I burst into tears. "Take me away from Yoshiko." The words came as a surprise even to myself. The madam rose to her feet and breathed a barely audible sigh. Then I made an utterly unpremeditated slip of the tongue, one so comic, so idiotic, that it all but defies description. I said, "I'm going somewhere where there aren't any women." Flatfish was the first to respond. With loud guffaws, the madam tittered, and in the midst of my tears I turned red and smiled despite myself. "An excellent idea," said Flatfish, still continuing his inane laughter. "You really ought to go to a place with no women. Everything goes wrong as soon as women are around you. Yes, a place without women is a fine suggestion." A place without women. And the first of it was that my delirious ravings were later to be realized in a most ghastly way. Yoshiko seemed to have got the right idea that I had swallowed the overdose of sleeping pills by way of atonement for her sin, and this made her all the more uncertain for me. She never smiled, and she looked as if she could hardly be persuaded to open her mouth. I found the apartment so oppressive that I would end by going out as usual to swill cheap liquor. After the dial incident, however, I lost weight noticeably. My arms and legs felt heavy, and I often was too lazy to draw cartoons. Flatfish had left some money when he came to visit me. He said, "It's a little gift from me," and offered it exactly as if it were his own money, though I gathered that it actually came from my brother's as usual. This time, unlike when I ran away from Flatfish's house, I was able to get a vague glimpse through his theatrical airs of importance. I too was clever, and pretending to be completely unaware of what was going on, humbly offered Flatfish my thanks for the money. It nevertheless gave me a strange feeling, as if at the same time I could and could not understand why people like Flatfish resorted to such complicated tricks. I did not hesitate to use the money to go by myself to the hot springs of southern Izu. However, I am not the kind to take the leisurely tour of hot springs, and at the thought of Yoshiko, I became so infinitely forlorn as to destroy completely the peaceful frame of mind which would have permitted me to gaze from my hotel window at the mountains. I did not change into sports clothes. I didn't even take the waters. Instead, I would rush out into the filthy little bars that looked like souvenir stands and drink gin until I fairly swam in it. I returned to Tokyo, only sicklier for the trip. The night I returned to Tokyo, the snow was falling heavily. I drunkenly wandered along the rows of saloons behind the Ginza, singing to myself over and over again, so softly it was only a whisper. From here, it's 100 miles to home. From here, it's 100 miles to home. I walked along, kicking with the point of my shoes the snow which was accumulating. Suddenly I vomited. This was the first time I had brought up blood. It formed a big, rising sun flag in the snow. I squatted there for a while. Then with both hands, I scooped up snow from the places which were still clean and washed my face. I wept. Where does this little path go? Where does this little path go? I could hear indistinctly from the distance, like an auditory hallucination, the voice of a little girl singing. Unhappiness. There are all kinds of unhappy people in this world. I suppose it would be no exaggeration to say that the world is composed entirely of unhappy people. But those people can fight their unhappiness with society, fairly, squarely, and society, for its part, easily understands and sympathizes with such struggles. My unhappiness stemmed entirely from my own vices, and I had no way of fighting anybody. If I had ever attempted to voice anything in the nature of a protest, even a single mumbled word, the whole of society, and not only Flatfish, would undoubtedly have cried out flabbergasted. Imagine the audacity of him talking like that. Am I what they call an egoist? Or am I simply the opposite, a man of excessively weak spirit? I really don't know myself. But since I seem in either case to be a mass of vices, I drop steadily, inevitably, into unhappiness. And I have no specific plan to stave off my descent. I got up from the snowbank with the thought. I had to get the proper kind of medicine without delay. I went into a pharmacy nearby. The proprietress and I exchanged looks as I entered. For that instant, her eyes popped, and she held her head lifted, as if caught in the light of a flashbulb. She stood ramrod stiff, but in her wide-open eyes there was no trace of alarm or dislike. Her look spoke of longing, almost of the seeking for salvation. I thought, she must be unhappy too. Unhappy people are sensitive to the unhappiness of others. Not until then did I happen to notice that she stood with difficulty, supporting herself on crutches. I suppressed a desire to run up beside her, but I could not take my eyes away from her face. I felt tears starting, and saw then the tears brimming from her big eyes. And that's where we're going to pause it for this part. We'll be finishing this tomorrow. We're on starting on page 159 of my copy. I hope you've been enjoying No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai, read by Sleepless Tales. Don't forget to like, comment, favorite, and subscribe, and the rest. You're doing great. I'm so proud of you. Have a great night. I love you.